All That's Left is made possible by our Patreon supporters. To help us continue this work, please consider contributing at patreon.com/leftvoice and make sure to visit our website at leftvoice.org. Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Joe Biden has now been in office for 2 full years, putting us halfway through the first term of his presidency. On today's episode, we're focusing on US imperialism during this 2-year period. In January 2021, Biden inherited a very unstable regime. US institutions had been bruised and battered from 4 years of Donald Trump, whose America First isolationist policies meant that American leadership globally had been weakened. This, of course, came after several decades of US hegemonic decline and crises of capitalism. In this context, where the US had withdrawn from global diplomatic institutions, where there was less faith overall in the US's ability to lead the world, the Biden administration had a clear agenda. It was to restore legitimacy to the institutions of US democracy, and to try to restore US imperialism to its former glory by returning to some aspects of the multilateralism that characterized US international relations before Trump. In fact, in his first major foreign policy speech back in February of 2021, Biden declared that, quote, "America is back." The Biden administration's first major policy move was a humiliating military withdrawal from Afghanistan. But US imperialism has come a long way since then. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, despite its challenges, has in some ways been a gift for US imperialism, and has helped to strengthen and expand NATO and US power in Europe. Biden's foreign policy has also been characterized by a so-called pivot to Asia. Like his predecessors, both Democratic and Republican, Biden is moving forward with a long-term strategy of more aggressively confronting China. This has, on the one hand, taken the form of military containment and strengthening alliances in the Pacific region. But it also includes economic competition, where the Biden administration is trying to decouple the two economies. So, to this end, the US has, for example, placed restrictions on China's ability to access semiconductors, and has begun investing billions in establishing domestic chip manufacturing. But through all of this, one thing is certain. Any conflict, any economic instability, will fall squarely on the working class, both in the US and abroad. The working class is international, and it's critical for workers here in the US especially, in the heart of imperialism, to mobilize, to build solidarity across borders, and to denounce imperialism. To discuss this and more, I'm joined today by Left Voice editor Sam Carliner, a name you'll recognize because he happens to be the other host of this podcast. Sam and I will discuss the terrain of US imperialism as Biden took office 2 years ago, and the major contours of his foreign policy during this time period. In particular, today we're going to focus on the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, as well as on China, and we'll wrap up with some thoughts on what the future holds, especially now that Republicans have regained control of the House of Representatives. Also, in addition to being the 2-year anniversary of the Biden administration, it's also the 1-year anniversary of this podcast. So before we get started, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you who've listened this year. Thank you for smashing the like and subscribe buttons, so to speak. And if this is the first episode you're listening to, make sure to check out our back catalog of episodes. We're excited to bring you lots more analysis this year. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, this is going to be an exciting conversation, but also just an exciting crossover event. A treat for our valued listeners as the podcast's two esteemed hosts are together in one and the same episode. How do you feel being in the interview hot seat today?
I am really excited. I have done interviews. I have both conducting, being a guest. I don't know which one I prefer. It's always nice to switch it up.
I promise I'll go easy on you. I won't.
Don't.
I'll. This will be a nice little conversation. We will continue to be comrades after this for sure. So it has been 2 years since Joe Biden took office. And on the topic of imperialism, it's also, I think, just been about 2 years since the first foreign policy speech he gave, where he famously proclaimed, quote, America is back. So, I mean, I personally feel a little bit like the meme of the old lady from the Titanic, where she's like, it's been 84 years. But I mean, a lot has happened since January 2021 that I'd love for us to talk about today. But as we like to do, let us set the stage a little bit with a broad question. So, what was the state of US imperialism as Biden took power 2 years ago? And what were his goals as he took the reins from Donald Trump?
Yeah, so Biden was elected having to make up for a lot. So I'll try to be as cohesive and quick as possible, but there are a few important highlights of where US imperialism was. So, first of all, we've been seeing a state of US global hegemonic decline. Now, not every listener is an academic, nor should they be. That basically means the US's ability to be the unquestioned dominant power everywhere in the world. So throughout the 2000s, that had really been falling apart and was escalated by the 2008 crisis, by this crisis of neoliberalism, in which the traditional whole global structure of capitalism really started falling apart. And so, yeah, the unquestioned international power of the US was falling apart. And this crisis of neoliberalism is what largely led to Trump's election. An outsider candidate who was elected. And Trump was certainly not anti imperialist. He caused all sorts of interventions, from the assassination of Iranian generals to just using Twitter to threaten nuclear war with North Korea. And significantly, and we'll get much more into this, he really escalated confrontation with China with a trade war, which was just reckless. But what he was an imperialist, but a lot of the traditional sectors of imperialism really were in crisis through the Trump presidency, because he took sort of an isolationist approach. Not isolationist as in refraining from intervention, but acting much more unilaterally with US power, really pulling out of and deriding key alliances that the US typically maintained its power with. NATO, which again we will talk much more about, but NATO he hated it. All he did was talk about how awful it was for the United States. All sorts of trade deals he pulled out of.
Yeah, and he also pulled out of the Paris Agreement. I think Trump pulled out of the World Health Organization as well, and so those were two organizations and two agreements that Biden rejoined upon taking the presidency.
Exactly, and that brings us, yes, to the Biden presidency, because this caused a real crisis for the typical sectors of US imperialism. And Biden was elected as a stability president, both for domestic policy and for international policy. He was elected with this promise to restore the US relationships with key allies, to reassert US power and hegemony internationally. And that essentially was his task. And at first, he was not succeeding that well at it. And that's really not a testament to Biden necessarily. It's a testament to just how challenged and in decline and in crisis U.S. power was. Now, I want to be very clear. The U.S. is still by far the imperialist power. No imperialist or regional power really compares. But compared to its, post-Cold War, end of history power, no, it wasn't going to be there. And we saw him really struggling to reassert U.S. influence, to re-establish close ties with key allies. We saw the very, very public crisis with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, which was a military defeat for the United States, and then that defeat played out in the most humiliating way possible. So it was very much looking like America was very much not back. And we will, I know we'll be getting into this. It may be your next question even, but of course, something happened last year, Russia invading Ukraine, which has changed a lot. But in general, you really can define Biden's presidency in 2 years. One of him really, really struggling, and one of him finding his footing in terms of imperialist policy.
Yeah, I feel like that would be a really great place to take this conversation now, is to one of the most notable events or notable conflicts since Biden took power, which is the war in Ukraine, which is nearing its, I guess, 1 year anniversary. Could you talk a little bit about the US's role in that conflict, in terms of, like, especially what it has meant for a departure from Trump's isolationist policies, like you were mentioning earlier, but also what it has meant for the expansion of NATO and the US's involvement in that region of the world?
Absolutely. So before I get specifically into that, let's just talk about part of this, not talk about, like, just a little quick note. A big part of this whole crisis of decline of US hegemony has caused all sorts of powers to rise as regional powers. So India and Asia and Indonesia as well, Turkey, Brazil, less so under Bolsonaro, but another key, like maybe the main regional power that the US has been concerned about is Russia in Europe. It is not an imperialist power, or at least that's Left Voice's definition. We have episodes of the podcast that get into that. But it is a regional power. It has an inherited massive military. It does have some leverage with how much of its exports play an important role in the European economy. And it is out of the influence of US imperialist interests and preferences. So for a while now, the United States has been wondering, okay, what do we do about Russia, this power player in the region that does not fall to our influence? And this, even before the invasion, was a big thing. You could read it in the pages of Foreign Affairs. You could see the US was very concerned. And the Russian invasion happens in February. And let's be very clear, the Russian invasion is reactionary. It offers nothing for the working class. It is not a legitimate defense of Russian security interests, as some people would make it out. I will say that Russians have every right to be concerned about US and Western imperialist expansion, but that's not what Putin cares about. Putin cares specifically about Russian capital. All of that laid out, this invasion has provided the context for the US to do something that it has very clearly wanted to do for a long time, which is strengthen NATO, which is a military alliance from the Cold War, and essentially reassert US dominance over Europe, both Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Now, of course, it's not that the US is the power in Europe. That's what's sort of playing out. And there's a whole, we can get more into it, but there's various conflicting interests within NATO. But as a result of the Russian invasion, the United States was able to put forward this line that the Biden administration had, since he was elected, been putting forward, this idea that the world is democracies versus autocracies, and the US represents the democracies, and we need to fight for the democracies. And no one was having that. Like even like the Western European powers like France and Germany that like buy into that prior to the invasion were like, we're not doing this. Like and in large part that was a consequence of Trump's unilateralism. But as a result of the Russian invasion, it held a lot more weight, and the US was able to get these Western European powers, which had sort of been acting more independently, pursuing their own types of policies. The US was essentially able to be like, nope, what we've got to do is we've got to really make sure that Russia is not able to reestablish itself as a power. And you have this historic levels of rearmament of NATO powers, of Germany spending all sorts of money on its military. And you can even, in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, Olaf Scholz, the I believe Chancellor of Germany, Chancellor of Germany, has been writing about like how important it is for Germany to boost its military. You have Sweden and Finland, historically, quote, air quotes, neutral countries that are now likely to join in NATO. You have, and mind you, Finland borders Russia. So this would be the first time that NATO literally borders Russia. You have Switzerland, engaged in economic warfare, sanctions on Russia in response to the invasion, another historically neutral country. And so, and these are the European countries. We haven't even covered the United States, which just passed an 858, roughly, because the numbers are always like changing and going to different things and not being tracked, but roughly $858 billion budget passed with bipartisan support. And a really wild clause that's in it is there's essentially an amendment which deregulates. I mean, the military and weapons manufacturers are already deregulated, but slipped into this recently passed military budget is an amendment that gets rid of existing provisions to, limit how many weapons US weapons manufacturers can produce so that they can fast track production specifically to provide Ukraine with more weapons. And already the weapons that the United States has provided to Ukraine make up the largest arms transfer in US history. And so what we see is, quite frankly, proxy warfare. What the United States and NATO powers are doing is they are using the Russian invasion to fight Russia, and we've seen I can't always keep track of who said what. I believe it was Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, although it may have been Secretary of State Antony Blinken, but one of them said out loud that this war, the goal of this war, and the U.S. providing weapons to Ukraine is to militarily weaken Russia, which was always its plan, even before the invasion, which was always essentially what it wanted to do. But now it can do that, and we see this really disgusting way in which the United States is waging a proxy war through Ukrainians, and doing and using it not just to wage warfare against Russia, but to reestablish its ability to control what France does, what Germany does, what all of these European powers, which had sort of been acting a bit more independently. Uh, the U.S. is sort of successfully getting them to go along with what the U.S. wants to be doing in Europe. And I know I just said a lot, but I think one more thing, uh, and feel free to follow up if I didn't cover anything. One more thing that I think is important to note is that all of these, this increasing of militarization of these powers and this proxy warfare with Russia is also in large part taking a long-term view towards military buildup to confront China, which remains the U.S.'s main, not the United States's. Because the U.S. imperialism and capital specifically remains their main adversary, their main competitor.
Yeah, I want to get to China in a moment because that is obviously a really huge and important topic. Your answer that you just gave was super interesting and helpful. I mean, earlier you mentioned Biden's failures, especially with like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also if we look even more broadly, we know that he took power during a lot of kind of compounding crises, not to mention even the coronavirus pandemic and things like that. But would you say, kind of as a way of wrapping up this discussion about NATO and Ukraine, that broadly speaking, this is an area where the Biden administration is actually succeeding? Like, especially if we say that, the US's goal is to show America is back, it's to re-legitimize these institutions of US imperialism, bolster its declining hegemony. It does kind of seem like this is one front of US imperialism that is kind of succeeding for Biden.
So I am going to read a quote, which I am not the first person in foreign policy geopolitical analysis on the left to reference this quote, but it's very important, which is that when NATO was founded in 1952, as again an offensive military alliance during the Cold War, there was a British general, Hastings Ismay, who said this, described the alliance as this: the point of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. So essentially, NATO was a military alliance founded to keep US power dominant in Europe, keep Russian power out of Europe, and keep Germany from rising as a power in Europe. And we see now, more than half a century later, that NATO is serving that purpose, and it is Biden who is Biden with, as a result of the gift that really Putin gave him. But essentially, it is Biden doing this. He is very much succeeding at using the U.S. role in NATO to reestablish the United States and U.S. interests in Europe, to weaken Russia, and we will see if he succeeds at keeping other powers in Europe, Germany, I would say, being the main one to follow. We'll see if he succeeds at keeping them from establishing a more independent policy in the long run, but certainly right now he has been successful at essentially dictating what various European powers, such as Germany, such as France, have to do. So yeah, I would say essentially this is an area where he has been able to bring American hegemony back in a specific region.
So obviously, when we talk about Ukraine, Russia, NATO, there are a lot of developments here that are a big departure from Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy, both from the kind of obvious fact that like this conflict began under Biden and not under Trump, but also from the fact that, like, from what you've described, it's been kind of a departure from Trump's isolationism, his America First kinds of policies, and things like that. But I want to go back to obviously the big imperialism and foreign policy theme of China, which is a theme that really runs through both the Biden and the Trump presidencies, but also even the Obama presidency. I mean, especially also the second Obama administration. So under all of these presidencies, one of the really huge goals and one of the really long-term strategies is containing the rise of China. So what can you say about this conflict with China?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, there's all these different regional powers cropping up that the US is concerned about. Russia being the main one. China is not a regional power. China is very much becoming a global power, expanding to markets in Africa, in Latin America, making important alliances and trade with Europe, and of course in the Asia Pacific. And this is terrifying to US capital. This is the first time that they really have a key competitor which is able to pursue its interests beyond its own region. China is the focus of US imperialism. It is the top priority, and you see this in the documents of US imperialism. You read it in the pages of Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council of Foreign Relations, which is essentially where all of the different imperialists debate what to do. And they have all of these debates over what to do about Russia, what to do about Iran, what to do about whatever. They all agree that US imperialism needs to make China stay in a lane that is satisfactory to US power. And additionally, Biden released his national security strategy. You had the 2023 budget proposal document, and if you read through them, they all say up front that China is their main concern. The Pentagon budget proposal of 2023 was released when Russia had already invaded, and they straight up say, while the war and the invasion of Ukraine helps us understand that we need to pay significant attention to Russia, again, they say, even with all that, China is still our main concern. Additionally, and we can get a bit more into Taiwan, although I'd say maybe let's not get too deep into it because there's so much there, but it should be noted that actually even within the official document of the National Defense Authorization Act, the military budget, Taiwan is mentioned 438 times, whereas Russia is only mentioned 237 and Ukraine is only mentioned 159. And Taiwan is absolutely the flashpoint of US conflict with China. So the fact that it's mentioned that many times really speaks to a focus on China. And this is absolutely not something that started with Biden. I would actually say it started with Obama. So in a way, it sort of started with Biden, but it started really with Obama's pivot to Asia, which was about understanding China is our main competitor, and we need to focus our foreign policy and our imperialist policy on that. And then it greatly escalated under Trump, which, as I mentioned, Trump pursued this really reckless trade war with China, And he just made all sorts of chauvinistic speeches where he talks about China or whatever, however he pronounced it with that weird emphasis.
Yes. And just to clarify about the term
Mm-hmm.
pivot to Asia, my understanding is that it refers to pivoting away from the Middle East toward Asia, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, and thank you for clarifying that. And I would say not even just the Middle East, but the overall war on terror focus. And I want to be very clear. A lot of people say the war on terror is over. It's not. It's still very much a thing
Definitely.
that the US military is using resources on, but it's the pivot to Asia really marked an acknowledgement that this is not actually our main focus. This is not what our resources should be prioritized for. It should be prioritized for building up our power within Asia. There's so much to talk about here, so I'll try to maybe if we can break it up. But before we get into maybe more details about how the United States under Biden is continuing this strategy. Yeah, I would just say so. It started with Obama, really escalated under Trump, and a huge thing that has really crystallized under Biden is just how bipartisan, just how in agreement all the different sectors of US imperialism are on this understanding that U.S. imperialism needs to focus on the competition that China poses and that's where the resources should be focused.
What would you say are the differences between Biden's approach to this long term confrontation with China and Trump and the Republicans' approach to this confrontation?
So there's a loaded answer. Well, let's start with the similarities first, because Trump was too stupid to wage a trade war. Well, which not that I want like a well waged trade war, but let's just say that Biden is waging a trade war. And whether or not he does it well, I actually think is to be seen. But he passed what is the CHIPS Act, which is very much, I mean, even in like capitalist publications, they are saying this marks the official start of a new Cold War with China. Because essentially, what it does is chips are really key technology. It refers to semiconductor chips, which, yeah, refers to key technology for rising sectors, important sectors of the economy. That if you're going to be the capitalist power, you need to be able to produce chips. And Biden has recognized that. And the CHIPS Act greatly targets China's ability to access the materials it needs to produce these technologies. And it greatly is an economic warfare. And what's notable is that it's an economic warfare which also hurts the US in some ways. And so what we're seeing is a delinking of the US and Chinese economy, which is going to, and because these are the two biggest economies and they function they're so interconnected, this is going to have ripple effects. We saw just how much Trump's trade war hurt farmers but Biden is pursuing this anyways, and I think that's really important to note that what we're seeing, and we're also seeing it in major publications talking about the need to delink. So what we're seeing is the United States recognizing there is no way that we can confront China unless we delink our economies. And so even if that causes some harm and some economic crisis, we will make those sacrifices in order to be able to really confront China, really keep it from growing economically. And I think that's in some ways a product of the Trump administration, in which Trump very much escalated this idea that the United States, that the United States needs to delink its economy in order to focus on uh, confronting China.
So when it comes to the first topic we covered, which was about like NATO, Russia, Ukraine, um, in that conflict, the U.S. actually has managed to have a pretty big influence on European powers, like managed to establish a lot of unity, kind of re-legitimize the U.S. in the eyes of these powers. But as you wrote about in a recent piece, and as we've written about before, there are a lot of complications when it comes to getting other countries and across the world on the US's side in trying to counter China's rising influence. Can you talk a little bit about some of the complications for the US when it comes to getting this international support for its confrontation with China?
Any country that is not the United States is stupid to sacrifice economic relations with China. And let me be very clear. Like, I'm talking from the perspective of capitalists who we all hate and who we don't agree with. But yeah, for capital, particularly in Europe, it's actually a really horrible thing for this delinking to happen. And we saw that Biden uh, essentially, along with the CHIPS Act, is ramping up this focus on America being able to have an independent economy. Again, really a carryover from the Trump's policy, but just Biden is a bit smarter about how to do it. But this really actually harms France. It harms Germany, and you can see them really pushing for their ability to not have to sacrifice their relationship with China. In fact, the essay I mentioned from Foreign Affairs by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the one I referenced earlier, while it's very explicit about how much Germany is totally cool going along with the U.S. And NATO proxy warfare with Russia, the other main thing that he writes is actually no, we're not really interested in choosing between the US and China. And so the ability of the United States to get all of its other imperialist powers on board with confrontation with China, I think, is limited. And we will see how that plays out. I will note that, and this may be your next question, or if not, I'd recommend maybe it should be. But I will say, within the Pacific, the United States under Biden is very much advancing. It's very much advancing its military containment strategy of China. But in terms of economic strategy, that's a lot more tricky, and it absolutely would need European powers on board in order to successfully confront China. And I'm not sure how successful the United States will be at that, considering just how much it really would. It would be idiotic, quite frankly, for Germany and France and other European countries to go along with this. And we'll see how that plays out at the NATO summit for the first time, at the 2022 NATO summit for the first time ever. NATO listed China as an adversary of NATO, as a concern for NATO. And a lot of people made it out that this is like a big sign of the US successfully getting European powers to move closer to its desire to confront China. I don't actually believe that. My guess is that it was a concession from these European powers that it was able to force. And I think realistically, if NATO begins to divide more, it will be over just how many members are not actually interested in confronting China. But we'll see. I mean, if 2022 showed us anything, it's that you never know how buck wild imperialists are going to go.
Yeah, I mean, just to get like even more concrete here into what you're saying about like how extremely foolish it would be for countries like Germany and other places to like eschew Chinese technology and to like completely decouple from China. I mean, there are just ways in which Chinese technology and things like that have just like such a huge insurmountable lead when it comes to technology from elsewhere. So I don't know how recent these statistics are, but I think I recall that, like, for example, around 90% of like the most advanced microchips are produced in Taiwan specifically. And then there's also the huge advantage that China has when it comes to 5G technology and things like that. And so that was one of the really big reasons why, for example, Germany had a hard time deciding on whether to ban Chinese 5G technology, is because China has such a big advantage here in these technologies. And so yeah, I think it's just worth pointing out that like just on a really like concrete material basis, it is so hard for these companies, or rather for these countries, to reject Chinese technology and to like avoid trade with China. And something, I mean, that also, even getting more specific into the technology here, um, we wrote about, I think last month or whenever it was, the mobilizations at the Foxconn factory in China, and I don't remember exactly what the percentage was here, but the enormous amount of, or the enormous proportion of Apple technology and Apple products that are produced, like literally specifically at a small group of Foxconn factories. And so I guess I'm just trying to say here that this decoupling, as much as Biden wants it to happen, it is something that is going to be incredibly complicated and is something that, as you've pointed out, is not desirable for a lot of other countries, and is certainly a really huge challenge for a lot of even US based companies like Apple, and especially like these tech giants that are so dependent on China for these products.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I'm hesitant to get more into it. I appreciate you laying that out, and I know you have way more of a background in economics than I do, so that's useful. But no, yeah, it's there's I mean, there's just no way it can happen without all sorts of crises being escalated. But as I said before, I think that in mind actually helps us understand just how wild and concerning about the lengths that the US is willing to go. The fact that in spite of those contradictions and risks, it is choosing to pursue this policy anyways. And I do want to get a bit more into the military containment strategy, because
Yeah, please
that's
do.
absolutely significant. And that is where the US has advanced way more under Biden. And this is because, unlike Trump, who, yeah, as we talked about, was very isolationist, very acting unilaterally and just belligerent, Biden essentially is much better at maintaining alliances. And let's be clear, the United States since World War II has been the military power in the Pacific. So it's not like it's new for the U.S. to have so much military influence over countries within the Asia Pacific region, but absolutely this is something that is advancing. We see the Quad Alliance, which consists of the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. And this is sort of the main military alliance that the United States has been using very much to check China's power. In terms of India, is a challenge for the United States in that in many ways it does fall under US influence. It has its own reasons that it is on board in many ways militarily checking China. But then, of course, we've seen India in regards to Russia strengthening its relationship with Russia following the Russian invasion. So anyways, that's an interesting thing in the Quad. But for the most part, Australia, 100% just a US proxy in the Pacific. Japan, with enthusiastic US backing, pursuing rearmament. Since it was defeated in World War II, it has had a pacifist constitution limiting its ability to engage in military conflicts, to increase its military, and just recently it passed legislation to, over the course of 5 years, increase its military to the point that it will be the third largest military in the world. And so this is very much a key military alliance to containing China that has always kind of been solidly in the US's interests, but is still very much advancing at a historic rate. We should also look at South Korea, which recently elected a far-right government. Now, South Korea, again, is another country that the U.S. military has never had to sweat its ability to dictate the policy and keep occupying areas of South Korea. That said, the previous president of South Korea pursued a bit more of a balancing act in terms of U.S. And China relations. And this new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, he ran on essentially a promise of really strengthening U.S. military cooperation, confronting China, confronting North Korea, and we see already in the peninsula escalations as a result of that. And so, yeah, that's another alliance that the United States is now able to really strengthen, has been strengthening, to pursue military containment. And there's the Philippines as well, which we don't need to get into as much just because I feel like I'm rambling. But and then one more note is the AUKUS alliance, which is a military alliance of the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, which is again focused on militarily containing China. And I one more thing I want to note is that while we talked about these divisions of, what other imperialist allies can the United States count on to confront China, Canada and the United Kingdom, they're good. They're not good, not good for the working class, but for U.S. interests, they're on board. So, of course, there's all of these different military partners that the United States is using, and we can't really end this conversation without touching on Taiwan, which we maybe have articles which we should include in the show notes, because this is the topic. I'm a little I think it warrants its own episode, quite frankly. But just so people know, as people remember, last year, you had a whole escalation in which Nancy Pelosi and quite a few other legislators visited Taiwan. And it needs to be understood that this was an escalation towards China. This was a provocation of China. Now, at Left Voice, we don't see China as benevolent. as some on the left tend to make it out to be, but it should absolutely be noted that there is, as I noted, in terms of just how much Taiwan is mentioned more than any other, more than Russia, more than Ukraine in the military budget. Uh, Taiwan is very much the flashpoint in which the United States would hope to militarily confront China. And we see this. The military budget that just passed actually provides billions of dollars in military aid to Taiwan. And so that was very much what Nancy Pelosi's trip was about. And so I think that's absolutely something to watch. Again, I'm a bit tempted to not get too into the details, if only because there is it is its own topic. I would feel like I can't do it justice, but I do think it should be noted that U.S. policy regarding Taiwan and these U.S. The U.S. providing weapons and meeting with Taiwan independence leaders, many of which they have a different meaning of independence than we at Left Voice do. We mean independence of the working class. They mean, falling within to U.S. capital's sphere of influence. These are very much should be understood as provocations and escalations of conflict in China, which are just reckless. And I think it says a lot that despite how reckless that trip was, despite how escalatory the providing of massive amounts of military weapons and training to Taiwan is, the United States is still pursuing it, and that says a lot about sort of where we see what lengths U.S. imperialism is willing to go to reestablish its power and confront what it sees as its main competitor, its main adversary.
Yeah, I think that's a really great overview of the situation. And I feel like it also provides a really great context for understanding what is to come this year from the Biden administration and then the next 2 years from US imperialism and also, I guess, geopolitics more broadly. Before wrapping this conversation up with our classic question about what the tasks are for the left, I do want to tie this all into a recent domestic development in the US. We talked about the bipartisan support for the long-term confrontation with China in particular. And I mean, we know and we write a lot about how imperialism is bipartisan despite some differences in how Republicans and Democrats approach foreign policy. But my question is, what do you think it'll mean for Biden's foreign policy now that Republicans have retaken control of the House of Representatives? So currently the Democrats only hold, or yeah, quote unquote, only hold the presidency and the Senate.
I don't really think it will change much, quite frankly. It's because, as we noted, U.S. imperialism is fully agreement on the main adversary it wishes to focus on. I will say that we've seen from Trumpist politicians, and then some of the more center right. It feels weird even calling them that, but in the grand scheme of things, center right members of the Republican Party, but certainly the far right of the Republican Party, there is more opposition to massive military budgets and weapons in regards to weapons to Ukraine, in regards to NATO. But we should understand that this is not at all a reflection of any anti-war, anti-imperialism, anti-militarism positions. Is that there's essentially a debate playing out right now in regards to the war in Ukraine about is militarily focusing on Russia and confronting Russia in the long run going to help the United States confront China? Or can the United States better confront China if it kind of stockpiles its resources specifically to focus on China? And that would require not focusing as much on proxy warfare with Russia. So that's really the main debate. And when we see members of the far right, signaling, oh, we need to cut this military budget, we need to stop focusing so much on Ukraine, it's not because they have any problem with war, it's because they have a problem with which war we're focusing on at a given moment. And I also think it should be noted that many of them, part of why they tend to be, these far right politicians tend to be more in favor of pulling resources out of certain areas, is because they also really want to wage domestic war. Now, let's be very clear. Biden, big fan of militarizing the police, militarizing the border. He's doing it right now. But definitely, I think the far right is much more of that is their thing. They want to be explicit that that's what they support. And so I think that's another area where when you see certain members of the far right talking about pulling military resources out of some areas, it's not that they want to cut military resources. It's that they want to redirect it to the confrontation with China and militarizing the state in the United States to really ruthlessly crack down on left movements, on immigrants, on Black communities. And so that is essentially the main debate that we may be seeing in terms of Biden's imperialist policy. There's others that will probably play out that aren't as worth getting into, but for the most part, I do think we can assume that support for U.S. imperialism will remain overall bipartisan, as it always has been.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we talk about U.S. imperialism, we talk about how leftists in the U.S. in particular are really in the belly of the beast, or the belly of the imperialist beast, so to speak. And we often, I'd say you often especially, write about the really critical importance of anti-imperialism here in the US, and of not treating imperialism as like just this side issue that we can kind of like, we can take it or leave it, and treating it in the way that certain other sectors of the left do. So, with that being said, and kind of in a way of trying to wrap this episode up on a more hopeful and kind of inspiring note, what would you say are the tasks for the left going forward, especially for the US left?
We really need to foster this idea that US imperialism, and I'll just outright say it, the US military, is one of the most ruthlessly anti-worker institutions that exists. And that is going to be hard because, quite frankly, the United States and the US working class can tend to be kind of reactionary, can tend to be chauvinist. Not always, of course, but absolutely that is a thing that we're going to need to, as leftists, reckon with. And I think one thing that should be noted is that you had socialist publications like Jacobin lauding people like John Fetterman, who used his debate to position himself as tougher on China than the Republicans. Ilhan Omar, recently a member of the Squad, recently voted in support of in support of a new commission to focus on studying China as an adversary. The Squad has gone along completely lockstep with imperialist weapons shipments to Ukraine. And so that's absolutely a problem. And it's not uncommon to go to a picket line, which everyone should support. If you're on the left, like, yeah, you go to picket lines, you support them. That's not a question. But it is sometimes not uncommon to see at a picket line calls to protect American jobs. Bernie Sanders, every speech he gives, it's about how the labor movement, the point is to revitalize the country. So there's very I don't want to say nationalistic, because I do think that, there's different flavors of that, but a very, patriotic, US centric
A certain
understanding.
chauvinism, for sure.
Chauvinism, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Chauvinist, very chauvinist. And we have my Twitter header, at Sam in the Can, FYI, is my favorite piece of art from Left Voice, designed by our comrade Show Me. And it's all of these different workers from different international struggles that took place. And it says class struggle is international, because it is. The working class is one and without borders. And that is our power. It's that we're an international class. We are not just the masses in one country. We run the world. Logistics workers, everywhere, are waging struggles which completely disrupt the economy for all capitalists in all parts of the world. And I think recognizing that international nature and power of the working class is important, and the US working class needs to be a part of it, because at the end of the day, there's lots of people on the left who are pushing this perspective that we need an anti-war movement. And we do. I fully support everyone who is organizing for anti-war actions. But what I really think can really confront US imperialism, whether it's economic warfare, whether it's regime change, whether it's the fucking boots of the US military, what can really confront it is worker power. Imagine if, when there is a coup in Peru, which there is one taking place right now, if US workers who work for companies that reap the resources of Peru, imagine if those workers went on strike and said, we will not work at this company in the United States until you meet the demands of the anti-coup protesters. Workers, imagine if dock workers, if logistics workers, if the recently sabotaged rail workers refused to supply weapons to proxy warfare with Russia, or really anywhere US weapons are going. They go a lot of places. We've seen that happen in Greece with Greek workers refusing to supply NATO weapons. And we've seen workers in Belarus refuse to help Russian tanks go to Ukraine. Imagine if US workers stepped into that, if they also refused to send the resources of imperialism throughout the world. They have that power. Additionally, on logistics workers, as I think I mentioned, we're seeing them striking everywhere. In the UK, we saw them shut down the entire economy in South Africa, in South Korea. Imagine if we united those struggles, and if all of the different logistics workers this is a possibility maybe with UPS about to go into a contract struggle. Imagine if UPS and the UK and all of these different logistics workers united their struggles together, organized internationally for their various demands. What power would that have? And there's so many more examples, some of which we're actually seeing. We're seeing tech workers organize to refuse to support the Israeli apartheid state, which is the main ally of US imperialism in the Middle East. So there's so many different ways where workers in the United States really using their labor power can completely sabotage in a very real material way the aims of US imperialism, which, as we noted, remains the biggest force of violence and sabotage of worker struggle throughout the world, including in the United States, because we have seen the military crack down on their. Right now, they're policing the border. Right now, they are replacing workers from teachers to healthcare workers. We've seen them militarily respond to Black Lives Matter protests, which was class struggle. And so, yeah, imagine if we had a perspective within the United States, within the labor movement, that really understood the power and the obligation that we as workers in the heart of imperialism have to sabotage the biggest sabotager of class struggle. And I'm very hopeful, as you may be able to hear, but I want to add one more really hopeful note, which is that we do have a long way to go, as I noted, and the traditional labor bureaucracies are tied to the imperialist Democratic Party. But we also have a beautiful phenomena happening in the US labor movement, which is Generation U, which is ripe to take up this internationalist class struggle. This is a dynamic in the labor movement influenced by the Black Lives Matter uprising that understands the connection of oppression and exploitation. We've seen Starbucks workers, some of the most dynamic working class organizers right now, outright say that defending abortion and defending trans rights is a worker issue, and that this is part of their demands. And I'm sure there's so many more examples, I'm blanking on, but just the fact that Generation U is not coming from this traditional labor bureaucracy tied to the imperialist capitalist parties, but that is much more interested in militant action, in breaking the law, in organizing democratically of the rank and file, and in taking up essentially social justice unionism. The fact that they are starting to form with that perspective really creates a real opportunity for the working class in the United States to use its labor not just to fight for bread and butter demands, not just to fight against oppression domestically, but to fight against oppression internationally and unite with the working class internationally. And I think that is absolutely a perspective that I, through Left Voice, hope to foster, that I am sure our comrades hope to foster, and that, I hope anyone listening to this podcast will really think about and take up, whether you're directly a member of Generation U organizing, whether you're in the left. I think absolutely we see U.S. imperialism under Biden advancing towards great confrontation of world historic proportions. And so the response by the international working class needs to be just as great in its confrontation and just as historical in its implications.
Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/leftvoice.org, on Instagram at left_voice, and on Twitter at left_voice. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, and share the show with your friends, your family, coworkers, classmates, comrades, and anyone else who you want to radicalize. And finally, Left Voice is an independent, revolutionary socialist publication, which means that we completely rely on the support of our members and our sympathizers. So that we can continue to bring you more episodes of All That's Left, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftvoice. We're really excited about this project, and we hope that you'll join us on this journey.